Okay, so today I've got a speech by the 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump, when Scott Morrison went to the United States to visit President Trump September 20th, 2019. If I remember correctly, this was while the country was on fire. So while Australia is burning, Scott Morrison is off to America, and the news here is berating him for running away. And on September the 20th, 2019, at 8:39 p.m. in the Rose Garden, Scott Morrison did attend some sort of celebration where President Trump spoke to the Australian diplomacy. President Trump, Prime Minister Scott Morrison, Mrs. Morrison, Melania and I are immensely honoured to host you and the entire Australian delegation for a state dinner in the historic Rose Garden. I want to thank America's magnificent First Lady for this truly exquisite evening. Thank you very much to Melania. She worked hard. Thank you. Applause. Great job. So I will just add here that Melania has turned into a fine example of a lady in the diplomatic sense. Her commitment to her role as the First Lady has been a demonstrable position to others in the American political sphere right now. Tonight, we celebrate more than a century of loyal and devoted friendship between the United States and Australia. Both of our nations are blessed by the uncommon courage, unfailing commitment, and unyielding character. Our two countries were born out of a vast wilderness, settled by the adventurers and pioneers whose fierce self-reliance shaped our destiny. The first settlers carved out a home on the frontier and forged our defining national traits. Americans and Australians hold within our hearts a great love of family, a profound allegiance to our fellow citizens, a deep respect of law and liberty, and a determination to protect our independence at any cost. It is this free and proud spirit that has always driven our people to imagine, to build, to achieve what others never even dreamed possible. From the wide open landscapes of the West and the outback rose up cowboys and sheriffs, rebels and renegades, miners and mountaineers. Against incredible hardships, our people have produced abundant harvests, pushed the bounds of science and exploration, and created timeless masterpieces of art, music, and culture. The defiant spirit of our people has also armed our nations with the strength to overcome any foe that dares to trample on our sovereignty, threaten our citizens, or challenge our freedom. This evening, we honour every Aussie and American hero who has paid the supreme sacrifice so that we might live in safety and in peace. In June of 1940, during the Second World War, a renowned Australian writer published a song in the Australian Woman's Weekly. The song rallied the entire nation, and it remains an inspiration to patriots everywhere. Its lyrics are now printed on Australia's RBA note $10 bank note. On the credit, its lyrics are now printed on the foe's money. the RBA. Are you at war with the RBA? Said one side to the Treasurer. So there's a few things here that I can take note of. In June of 1940, during the Second World War. Now, lyrics printed on a banknote from 1940 during the Second World War, where something happened to introduce this IMF in the first place, that brought around this Reserve Bank currency that would have these lyrics printed on it in microprint, no doubt, in microprint. So you need a magnifying glass to even read the words of warning that warn you against using the credit of a foe, the credit of a banker. So as we continue, the poem concludes by reminding the world that Aussies will always defend their cherished homeland. And it says, "We are the sons of Australia, of the men who fashioned the land. We are the sons of the women who walked with them hand in hand. And we swear by the dead who bore us, by the heroes who blazed the trail, no foe shall gather our harvest or sit on our stockyard rail." And that's what's happening right now before you. It's all collapsing around you. As many of our friends with us here tonight know well, the acclaimed Australian author who penned these beautiful lines was Dame Mary Gilmore, and her great-great-nephew is Prime Minister Morrison. Applause. Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Thank you. That was beautiful. President Trump. Prime Minister, on behalf of all Americans, our entire country, we are grateful that you carry on this noble legacy. We give thanks to all the sons and daughters of Australia who have toiled and sacrificed for a strong, vibrant, and sovereign nation. So this evening, I offer a toast to the Prime Minister and Jennifer. Thank you, Jennifer. And to every citizen of Australia, may our heroes forever inspire us. May our heritage always guide us. May our values always unite us. And may our nations always remain the home of the proud and the brave and the free. And the free. There's not one mention of a Commonwealth of Australia. There's not one mention of God. There's not one mention of a people united in that federal Commonwealth. This is Australia. So we could look at the Treaty of Ghent 1814, 1816, and see this agreement between the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and the United States of America. We can see that agreement written in pen. So when we come forward to this introduction by President Trump, which uses the words on our credit machines, paper, plastic note, bank note, Australia's $10 bank note, we can see that this is pro-debt machine. But we have this connection in Scott Morrison, wherein he is of a lineage as great-great-nephew to Dame Mary Gilmore, who appears on the $10 note. We continue. I'd like to raise a glass to very special people and a very, very special country. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Thank you very much. A toast is offered. I now invite Prime Minister Scott Morrison to the podium. Mr. Prime Minister, applause. Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Well, he got me. Dame Mary, my great-great-aunt, would be very, very proud. Mr. President, First Lady, Mrs. Trump, thank you so much, Mrs. Trump, for the amazing night you've created for us here. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, Jenny and I are truly grateful for this wonderful honour and the hospitality that you, Mr. President, and the First Lady have extended to us and to our country as we join you here tonight in the home, your home, and that of the American presidency. This, of course, was once the house of President Teddy Roosevelt, who I've always greatly admired. He was also a New Yorker. President Trump. That's true. Prime Minister Scott Morrison. He was also unconventional. Laughter. He was no captive of the establishment. He was also accomplished. Indeed, some might say a maverick, but he was his own man. He was a doer, and above all, he was inspired by the great character of the American people. There is nothing he believed his nation could not do, and this is the heart of American greatness. Mr. President, your belief in America and its people echoes this great spirit of that great president, and it's backed up by your life's experience and the passion and work of your presidency. And Mrs. Trump, your kindness, warmth, and quiet grace in the welcome to Jenny and I, and especially here tonight, has been very special and, as Jen said, very sweet. General Washington once said, "It is infinitely better to have a few good many than many indifferent ones." The same is true in the friendship of nations. Australia will never be accused of indifference in our friendship to the United States. And tonight, Mr. President, we are reminded that the United States feels the same way, especially under your leadership. So we talked about the leader of the free world in a previous video, and we can see here some sort of link with Australia and this United States. Might go back to 1967 when Pine Gap was installed in the Northern Territory. So we look at this linking at the hip by something after our sovereignty was given to us. So when we look at the Treaty of Ghent 1814, we can see that it's an agreement of peace between two authorities. But bring that forward to the Hague Conventions, and we start to see it's a debt agreement. It's kind of like a banking arrangement. We can see that through DFAT and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in their use of the Hague Conventions to do that foreign trade in the Commonwealth of Australia. So we carry on. I've noticed tonight the Marines who are on duty tonight, and I thank you for your service, but not just the United States, but to our alliance as well. In 1943, the US Marine 1st Division was engaged in the first ever large-scale United States offensive against the Japanese at Guadalcanal. At the same time, Australian forces were in New Guinea, also locked in the fiercest of battles against the Japanese. We both prevailed, each doing our bit, each carrying our own weight. when the US Marine 1st Division arrived in Melbourne after 6 months of heavy fighting, they were welcomed with a rendition of the Australian fake anthem, Waltzing Matilda. More than 75 years later, the 1st Division still plays Waltzing Matilda whenever they ship out. 75 years of peacekeeping in the Commonwealth of Australia under this naming Australia. And it is a harsh reality to come to. As a country, you are stuck in a debt game wherein the leader of the free world ensures that you are going to pay your debts. It's the reason your country has fallen into a demise over the last 100 years and has gone from building palaces to building concrete structures and putting cameras up to raise revenue off all of you in a human trafficking and slavery incident. And this is all linked together. Trying to uphold a country by abusing the people that forged that country in the first place is not going to get those people to stand up and serve this country. The national government is attempting to get people to sign an oath to the government of the day, therefore negating any foundations in the blessing of Almighty God, King and country. And this is where soldiers should recognize their power as united in a federal commonwealth, defining that fabric of law to be that God and that border so defended by those soldiers in the very first. So when we look at 75 years of peacekeeping, we see the United Nations, and we see that model law has the force of law. But is model law in its commercial right the force of law over all of you? It would seem so, given that you have to go through uniform civil procedure rules to deal with matters of crime within your own court facilities. We must look at who serves who in this theatre. So as we carry on, it's true, Mr. President, we have been in a lot of battles, but we have also stood together to realize the dividend of peace, prosperity that comes from our embrace of enterprise and free markets and the rule of law. Our great immigration societies, education, liberal democracy, and a commitment to the fulfillment of human potential. No mention of mankind there, but there is a mention of rule of law. As administrators, they are obligated to The Hague and Geneva and all those other conventions, being that rule of law at the peril of one's own life for operating in an administration. As we carry on, this has been importantly included in our work together to expand the frontiers of science, technologies, and exploration to reach into space, as we first did together 50 years ago. 50 years ago, when you launched and we kept Apollo 11 in contact through the Honeysuckle project with Earth, and we beamed the most famous of images of all time to an enthralled and inspired humanity. Events that no doubt inspired a young Andy Thomas from Adelaide, who is with us here tonight, to launch into space on the Endeavour almost 30 years later. So we have this connection back to 50 years ago when Stanley Kubrick finally came out and admitting that the landing on the moon was a fabrication, which is kind of evident given that the way it's filmed, when one could ask how it's filmed. But we can open into that door some other time. We can demonstrate here 50 years, this 1943, Nixon later. We can tie in this Robert Menzies 1941 through this period right here that is establishing something that would finally see the lowering of the Admiralty ensign on the Commonwealth fleet in 1967. Carrying on. And now we have to do this again under the vision of your presidency, Mr. President. Our generation and our times call this great republic and our great commonwealth to live up to the calling of young, free nations to continually point the way to freedom by using someone else's money supply and being dependently locked into someone else's trade systems that would bring around some sort of digital currency that would allow some sort of banking system to grift the transaction fees off millions and millions and millions of transactions every single day. Is that freedom, Mr. Morrison? Carrying on. In Australia, we're reminded of this friendship by the great spire with the eagle atop that looks out across our nation's capital in Canberra. And earlier today, we gifted a bronze statue of Les Bull Allen, an Australian soldier, carrying a wounded Marine off the battlefield on steep slopes in New Guinea in 1943. For his gallantry, he was awarded the US Silver Star and the Military Medal whilst fighting alongside US troops. Mr. President, we would be honoured if you would permit Australia as our gift to erect a life-size memorial of this image here in Washington at a place of your choosing as a constant reminder of our dedication to our American friends and the inaudible and the bonds we have formed. What's the inaudible part there, Scott? Like what did you mumble? Something about bonds. What kind of bonds? War bonds? Stock market bonds? Bondage? Bondage through debt? Bondage through reserve currencies? Bondage through this Israeli problem 1933 that we pointed out? But for now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a toast to 100 years of mateship and to 100 more, to the people of these United States, to the President and his magnificent First Lady, and may God bless America. A toast is offered. Applause. President Trump, thank you very much. That's so beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Scott. I would now like to invite a very special person up to the podium to say a blessing. Reverend Franklin Graham. Thank you, Franklin. Thank you very much. Applause. End. 8:50 p.m. in the White House, in the Rose Garden. So 100 years, that would take us back to 1919 and a League of Nations that defined that sovereignty and put that federal standard and that royal standard on the table in the first place under Queen Victoria as a Commonwealth in international waters, putting those soldiers as land forces instead of national service. the government of the day, I think Albanese informed the ministers to write to all those soldiers. You will serve the government of the day. You will no longer serve your gods, your king, your country. You will serve the government of the day, which goes against everything that is being spoken here between President Trump under the Treaty of Ghent 1814 and Scott Morrison under things that preceded the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act and that foundation under the blessing of Almighty God. So what is interesting here is this Franklin Graham. We can look at his Christian upbringing and his evangelistic association connections. We can see that through 1970, expelled from school, 1973, founder of the Samaritan's Purse, 6-week mission to Asia, World Relief, graduated from Montreat Anderson College. That same year, on a trip to Jerusalem, he repented and experienced a new birth. In 1978, he graduated from the Appalachian State University with a BA. But he experienced a new birth in Jerusalem. So this is hardly foundational to the United States of America and the Church of Presidents, where President Trump stood out the front flexing a Bible over the top of, like some American administration, the Trump administration. This would bring us back to a civil war and Abraham Lincoln and the installation of Abraham Lincoln's citizenship model around the world. The debt machine started to grind. Geneva Conventions were agreed on for the treatment of prisoners of war in a long-running 150-year plus battlefield over finance. What we can see out of this is that we do in fact have real peace agreements with the true and de jure United States. What we can also see is that Australia, the nation state, not the Commonwealth of Australia, has this link to a United States credit machine that is currently falling into a trap with its petrodollar and the gateway through Zionism that exists in the Middle East. It is why at all costs they need to protect the debt machine that they brought into your lands to manage your affairs, to manage your GDP, to manage your fisheries, agriculture, mining, and so on. These are the rules of usufruct. But they overstepped the mark in 1986 when they took from you and put the debt directly on your backs. This puts sweat labor onto you as a slave to this debt machine, which is currently finding itself in a precarious position worldwide. Eventually, the truth will come down onto the table and all things will anchor with God. And those that see will defend, and those that don't might find themselves in the rules they wish they didn't sign up to. So we talk about serving the government of the day. Mob justice and more. The first independent study of abuse in the Australian Defence Force is damning. Participants expected the costs of war, but they were not prepared for the costs of service, explains Ben Wadham and James Connor in their new book, The First Independent Study of Military Institutional Abuse in the Australian Defence Force. Now, we looked at all these changes that occurred in the Commonwealth of Australia. We looked at this loss of power and this obligation of military power to something external. We saw the words of Robert Menzies. Participants expected the costs of war. What were those costs supposed to be? Warrior, soldier, brigand draws on interviews with nearly 70 survivors and analyses every review and inquiry into military culture, 35 in total, since the Vietnam War. But only the Vietnam War, only post-1967 here. I wonder why that would be. What sort of change changed a military into a defence force? It's a harrowing account of more than a century of widespread institutional abuse in Australia's military forces. Brutality was systematically inflicted on junior cadets who were beaten, violated, and humiliated under the rationale of bastardization. In a hypersexualized culture, misogyny and gender-based violence was endemic. Women were in constant danger of sexual assault from their peers and superiors. This abuse was often compounded by a second assault, where victims were punished for reporting their superiors, with administrative abuse and mob justice. The terms warrior, soldier, brigand were described. Different military identities are contested, as the authors concede. The Brereton Report, which found credible information to implicate 25 current or former Australian Special Forces personnel in the unlawful killing of 39 people in Afghanistan, also found that alleged war criminals self-identified as warrior heroes. So I don't know where these statements come from. They obviously don't come from 35 inquiries into from the Vietnam War to today, including the Brereton Report. 70 survivors is a very minimal selection here, and obviously from the Vietnam War forward. This sort of disconnects a lineage in a foundation of forefather here. And we can see this culture, this bastardization culture, exists well before those soldiers even leave this country on a plane to go out to some sort of theatre of war. You can read the rest of this article on The Conversation. The details of bastardization are horrific. Many times I thought the word torture would have been more apt to describe the physical, sexual, and psychological violence wrought upon Australian service personnel by each other. These are technically war crimes, crimes against humanity. That is a culture amongst a defence force, a culture against a people from that defence force. And this is what I spoke of earlier, when it is the responsibility of command for that culture. You don't breed into a soldier to fear everything in battle and then watch him go out onto the field and make mistakes that are then called war crimes that have been carried out while operating in that culture. Collective hazing, rituals including being belted with knotted wet towels and belts knocked off ladders and tables with fire hoses, strapped to moving vehicles, doused with foul chemicals, and forced to consume bodily waste. Blanket bashings, sleep deprivation, and gang rape were described as routine. Routine. Want to join the Australian Defence Force? Want to join the Australian Defence Force? Want to serve the government of the day and not God, King and country? Want to abuse the Constitution? Want to commit criminal acts against the Crimes Act and Criminal Code and the Constitution? Sexual violence was particularly pronounced. Bastardization is heavily invested in certain arrangements of the body, including penetrating body parts with objects, injuring genitals, and forcing victims to perform acts on superiors. Wadham and Connor argue the prevalence of bastardization forces ADF members to choose between being a victim or an offender. Members often become a perpetrator to escape being the victim of violence. And that's a culture that becomes a war crime. That's a culture that becomes a war crime. That's a culture that leads to task force commanders wanting to injure an entire population. That's a culture that doesn't care about the people it manages. That's a culture that is criminal in its very action, all the way to the top of the tree. And we can see that when we look at something else.
The world is engaged in the largest clinical trial, the largest global vaccination trial ever, and we will have enormous amounts of data. But what's the message for the public? It's safe, it's effective, it will help protect you, but it will also help protect your mum and dad, your grandparents, your nonna, all of Australia.
And yet, despite the fact that we've now essentially clinically tested the vaccine on billions of people worldwide, around 1 in 5 Americans is still willing to put themselves at risk and put their families at risk rather than get vaccinated. People are dying because of misinformation.
We all have a role to play. Employers, nurses, doctors, teachers, scientists, friends, family and neighbours. I know we'll all do our bit. Thank you for listening tonight, and good night, Australia.